A rich black woman threw a party, but she didn't tell anyone that she was the host. Many of the rich people were rude to her, so she decided that she was going to shock everyone at the end of the night. Before we get started, comment how old you are and where you are watching from. The city was abuzz with whispers, as if a secret had swept through its streets, leaving curiosity in its wake. No one knew where they came from, only that they appeared suddenly. Golden envelopes slipped under doors, tucked into mailboxes, or handed to unsuspecting passersby by a cloaked figure who vanished before anyone could ask a question. Inside each envelope was an invitation, beautifully handwritten in elegant script. You are cordially invited to a midnight masquerade. Come as you are, but know that masks will conceal more than faces this night. The invitations were sent to people from all walks of life. There was no rhyme or reason to the selection. Wealthy tycoons, socialites, artists, shopkeepers, and those who barely had enough to get by found themselves holding the same golden invitation. The address was clear: the Grand Regal Hotel, 10 p.m. sharp. Formal attire, masks required. The reactions varied as widely as the recipients themselves. In a penthouse overlooking the city, Margaret Whitmore held the invitation between her perfectly manicured fingers. She smiled, a sharp, satisfied smile. An event at the Grand Regal Hotel could only mean one thing: the elite of the elite would be there. She imagined the lavish gowns, the sparkling jewels, the who's who of society all gathered under one roof. A night to flaunt her status, to see and be seen. The thought thrilled her. She called her stylist immediately. Across town, in a cramped apartment that smelled faintly of paint and turpentine, Henry Thompson read the invitation with a mixture of disbelief and hope. He was an artist, though not a successful one, not yet. His paintings barely sold enough to cover his rent. The invitation felt like a lifeline, a chance to step into a world he'd only glimpsed from the outside. He didn't know who sent it or why, but the possibility of mingling with people who could appreciate and perhaps even purchase his art was too good to pass up. He set the invitation aside, his mind already turning to what little he could afford to wear. And then there was Evelyn Carter, who sat at her desk in her spacious office, surrounded by sleek technology and modern art. She looked at the list of confirmed attendees on her screen and smiled to herself. Everything was going according to plan. The invitations had been sent without any identifying markers. No logos, no names, just the promise of a night to remember. She'd chosen the guest list carefully, a mix of the city's wealthiest and those who rarely had the chance to brush shoulders with them. It was important that the night felt organic, that no one suspected the true purpose behind the event. Evelyn's assistant, a young woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, entered the room. Everything's ready, Miss Carter. The arrangements have been made at the hotel. Security is in place, and the staff has been briefed. The guests are all accounted for. Good, Evelyn replied, her voice calm and steady. Make sure no one knows who's behind this until the time is right. I want them to experience the night without preconceptions. The assistant nodded and left the room, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. She looked out the window at the city below, a landscape of lights and shadows. She remembered a time when she had nothing, when the city had seemed vast and uncaring. But she had worked hard, built her empire from the ground up, and now she had the power to do something meaningful. The Midnight Masquerade was not just a party. It was an opportunity to see what people were like when the masks were on, and more importantly, when they were off. With that, she turned back to her work, but not before picking up one of the golden invitations from her desk. She held it in her hand for a moment, then placed it back down. The night would reveal much, and she was ready. Across the city, anticipation grew as the hour approached. The guests, unaware of what lay ahead, prepared for the night with varying degrees of excitement and trepidation. Some, like Margaret, saw it as a chance to shine. Others, like Henry, saw it as a rare opportunity. But for all of them, the Midnight Masquerade promised a night of mystery, where the masks would hide their identities, but not their true selves. The Grand Regal Hotel stood like a beacon in the night, its tall windows aglow with soft, golden light. Outside, a line of sleek cars pulled up to the entrance, one after another, depositing their well-dressed passengers onto the red carpet that led to the grand doors. The air was crisp, the kind of night that promised something special, and the guests could feel it as they arrived, each one stepping out with a sense of expectation. Inside, the hotel was a vision of opulence. The lobby, with its marble floors and towering columns, was merely a prelude to the true spectacle that awaited them. The ballroom, located on the second floor, was a masterpiece of design. High ceilings adorned with intricate frescoes, crystal chandeliers that sparkled like 1,000 stars, and walls draped in rich velvet. The room was filled with the soft murmur of voices and the gentle strains of a string quartet playing from a corner stage. Guests entered the ballroom two by two, each one pausing for a moment to take in the grandeur. They were met by an array of servers dressed in black and white, offering flutes of champagne on silver trays. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the sound of rustling silk and velvet as the guests moved about, their masks adding an air of mystery to the already glamorous affair. Margaret Whitmore was one of the first to arrive. She stepped into the ballroom, her head held high, her mask, an ornate gold creation that matched her gown, firmly in place. She scanned the room looking for familiar faces, for those who mattered. To her, this was not just a party but a performance, a stage where she could display her wealth and status. She spotted a few acquaintances, equally well-dressed and masked, and made her way over to them, her voice low and filled with the practiced charm of someone who knew how to navigate these waters. "Well, isn't this a sight?" she said, her words accompanied by a practiced smile. "I can't wait to see who else shows up." "Indeed," replied one of the women in the group, her own mask a silvered piece with intricate filigree. "I hear the guest list is quite eclectic." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I suppose we'll have to see about that." As they continued their conversation, more guests filtered in, each adding to the growing hum of the room. Among them was Jonathan King, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo and wearing a simple black mask that emphasized his sharp features. He moved through the crowd with purpose, his eyes scanning for anyone who might be worth his time. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, and tonight would be no different. "Margaret," he greeted as he approached the group, his voice smooth. "Quite the event, isn't it?" She turned to him, her smile widening. "Jonathan, lovely to see you. Yes, quite the event, though I'm curious to see if it lives up to the mystery." "Time will tell," he replied, taking a glass of champagne from a passing server and lifting it slightly in her direction before turning his attention to the room at large. He was already calculating his moves, considering who might be useful to him tonight. While the wealthy guests mingled and exchanged pleasantries, another figure entered the ballroom, unnoticed by most. Henry Thompson stepped in, his eyes wide with awe as he took in the grandeur around him. He felt out of place, but he reminded himself that he had just as much right to be here as anyone else. His mask was a simple black one, nothing fancy, and his suit was borrowed from a friend, but he held himself with quiet dignity. He drifted through the crowd, avoiding eye contact with the more ostentatious guests, but his artist's eye couldn't help but appreciate the beauty of the room, the way the light played off the chandeliers, the way the colors of the gowns and masks blended into a living canvas. He didn't know who had sent him the invitation, but for now he was content just to be here, to soak in the experience. As he moved further into the room, he found himself near the stage where the quartet played. He paused, letting the music wash over him. It was a brief respite from the overwhelming luxury that surrounded him, a moment of peace. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said from beside him. Henry turned to see a woman standing there, her mask a deep blue with silver accents. She was dressed elegantly, but there was something about her that set her apart from the others, something calm and grounded. "Yes, it is," Henry replied, his voice quiet. "The music, it feels like it's telling a story." The woman nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Every good piece of art does. Whether it's music, painting, or even an event like this, there's always a story beneath the surface." Henry looked at her more closely, sensing that there was more to this woman than met the eye. But before he could ask her anything, she smiled and moved away, disappearing into the crowd. He watched her go, intrigued but not willing to chase after her. He had learned to let moments come to him rather than force them. Meanwhile, Margaret and Jonathan continued their circuit of the room, exchanging pleasantries and subtle barbs with those they deemed worthy of their attention. They hadn't noticed Henry, nor would they have cared if they had. To them, the evening was about maintaining their status, not about discovering something new or unexpected. As the night wore on, the ballroom filled with more guests, each one adding to the kaleidoscope of color and sound. The atmosphere grew livelier, the anticipation in the air almost palpable. Everyone was waiting for something, though what exactly they weren't sure. It was as if the night held its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would change. And in the midst of it all, Evelyn Carter watched from a distance, her eyes sharp behind her mask. She had seen Margaret and Jonathan, had observed their interactions and their dismissive attitudes. She had also noticed Henry, his quiet awe and the way he seemed to absorb the beauty around him. She knew the night was only beginning, and the real story had yet to unfold. For now she would let them enjoy the masquerade. But soon the mask would come off, and the truth would be revealed. Evelyn Carter moved through the ballroom like a shadow, unnoticed by most, which was exactly how she wanted it. Her mask, a deep blue with silver accents, concealed her identity perfectly. She was the architect of this evening, yet she remained on the periphery, observing the guests as they navigated the luxurious maze she had created. She knew every detail of the night, the music, the decor, the guest list, but tonight her role was to blend in, to be just another guest in the crowd. She drifted from group to group, her ears attuned to the conversations around her. "I heard the host is some eccentric billionaire," a man in a black tuxedo whispered to his companion, a woman in a crimson gown. "Apparently, they like to throw these kinds of events just to see how people react. Whoever they are, they certainly have good taste," the woman replied, her eyes scanning the room. "Though I wonder what the catch is. Nothing this grand comes without strings attached." Evelyn smiled to herself beneath her mask. She had anticipated such speculation. Let them wonder, she thought. The truth would come out soon enough. She continued to weave her way through the crowd, her gaze landing briefly on Margaret Whitmore, who was holding court with a small group of equally well-heeled guests. Margaret's laughter rang out, sharp and clear, as she recounted a story about a recent vacation in the south of France. The people around her listened with rapt attention, eager to bask in her reflected glory. "But really," Margaret was saying, "one must be careful about these so-called exclusive events. There's exclusive, and then there's, well, you know." She glanced around as if to make sure the right people were listening. "I just hope tonight lives up to its promise. It would be such a shame if it turned out to be a disappointment." Evelyn noted the subtle arrogance in Margaret's tone. To someone like her, this event was another opportunity to assert her superiority, to remind others of her wealth and status. Evelyn had seen this before, many times in fact, but tonight she was interested in something deeper. The masks the guests wore were not just physical. They were a reflection of the personas they adopted, the facades they presented to the world. Tonight she intended to see beyond them. Not far from Margaret's circle, Jonathan King was deep in conversation with a few business associates. His voice was low, measured, as he discussed market trends and potential investments. He too was playing a role, a successful entrepreneur, confident and in control. But there was a tension in his posture, a sense that he was always calculating, always looking for the next opportunity. Evelyn recognized it immediately. Jonathan was the kind of man who thrived in environments like this, where connections could be made and deals could be struck, but his focus on the material left little room for anything else. Evelyn paused, observing him for a moment longer before moving on. She had no doubt that Jonathan would be one of the more interesting guests to watch as the night progressed. People like him often revealed the most when they believed they were in control. As she continued her quiet exploration, Evelyn noticed Henry Thompson standing near the edge of the ballroom, almost hidden by the shadows cast by the towering columns. He was watching the room with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, his artist's eye taking in every detail. She saw the way he admired the chandeliers, the way he studied the interplay of light and color. Unlike Margaret and Jonathan, Henry was not here to make an impression. He was here to experience something new, something beautiful. Evelyn found herself drawn to him, intrigued by his quiet presence. She approached him slowly, not wanting to startle him, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, almost as if she were sharing a secret. "It's quite a sight, isn't it?" Henry turned, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized her from their brief encounter earlier. "Yes, it is," he replied, his voice still carrying that note of awe. "I've never seen anything like it." Evelyn smiled behind her mask. "That's the beauty of events like this. Every detail is meant to create a specific atmosphere, to make you feel like you've stepped into another world." Henry nodded, his gaze drifting back to the room. "It's like being inside a painting," he said quietly. "A living, breathing work of art." There was a sincerity in his words that struck Evelyn. Most of the other guests saw the event as a stage, a place to perform, but Henry saw it as something more, a work of art, something to be appreciated for its beauty and craftsmanship. It was a perspective she rarely encountered, and it intrigued her. "Are you an artist?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He hesitated, then nodded. "I am, though not a very successful one. At least not yet." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering him. "Success is a matter of perspective," she said. "What kind of art do you create?" "Mostly paintings," Henry replied, his voice warming as he spoke about his passion. "I try to capture moments, feelings, the things that often go unnoticed." Evelyn felt a connection to his words, a resonance with her own goals for the evening. "It sounds like you see the world differently than most people." Henry shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "Maybe. I just try to see what's really there." Their conversation was interrupted by a burst of laughter from across the room, drawing their attention. Margaret and her group were in high spirits, their voices carrying over the music. Evelyn watched them for a moment, then turned back to Henry. "Do you know many people here?" she asked. Henry shook his head. "No, not really. I was surprised to even get an invitation." Evelyn smiled softly. "Sometimes it's the unexpected invitations that lead to the most interesting experiences." Henry looked at her, a question in his eyes, but before he could ask it, Evelyn excused herself. "Enjoy the evening, Mr. Thompson," she said, giving him a small nod before slipping back into the crowd. She moved on, her mind turning over their conversation. Henry's perspective was a refreshing contrast to the self-absorbed chatter she had overheard from others. He saw beauty where others saw status, and that made him stand out in a room full of people eager to display their wealth and power. Evelyn continued her quiet observations, slipping in and out of conversations, always listening, always watching. The mask may have concealed the guests' faces, but their true natures were beginning to show. It was just as she had hoped. The night was a stage, and the players were revealing themselves with every word, every gesture. The evening was still young, but Evelyn could already see the seeds of what was to come. The guests were relaxed, comfortable in their roles, but that would soon change. The true test was yet to begin, and she was ready to see how they would fare when the mask came off and the illusion was shattered. For now, she would let them enjoy their masquerade. As the night deepened, the atmosphere in the ballroom grew more electric. The music, once a gentle backdrop to polite conversation, took on a livelier tempo. The guests, buoyed by the flowing champagne and the intrigue of the night, became more animated. Laughter rang out more frequently, and the conversations grew louder and more animated, filled with a mix of genuine curiosity and the ever-present undercurrent of competition. In the midst of this growing fervor, a subtle change began to take place. The guests, comfortable behind their masks, started to let down their guard. The masks, meant to conceal, seemed to give them permission to be more themselves, or in some cases to be more of who they wished they were. The ballroom, once a stage for elegant posturing, was slowly transforming into something more primal, more honest. Evelyn watched it all unfold from her vantage point near the grand staircase. Her eyes, sharp behind her mask, picked up on the smallest details. The way Margaret Whitmore's laughter had turned from a practiced trill to something almost desperate. The way Jonathan King's confidence seemed to harden into something colder and more calculating. The way Henry Thompson's quiet awe had shifted into a subtle but unmistakable discomfort. She knew the time was right. Evelyn stepped forward, signaling discreetly to the maitre d'. The man nodded, understanding her unspoken command. Within moments, the music softened to a quiet hum, and the lights dimmed slightly, drawing the guests' attention to the center of the room. The chatter and laughter subsided, replaced by a murmur of curiosity as the crowd instinctively gathered around, forming a loose circle. Evelyn moved to the center of the room, her presence commanding but not overpowering. She waited until she felt the weight of their gazes on her, then raised her hand slightly, signaling for silence. The room fell into an expectant hush. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth and clear, carrying easily through the room. "I trust you've all been enjoying yourselves tonight." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but most of the guests remained silent, intrigued by this sudden shift in the evening's events. Evelyn paused, letting the anticipation build before continuing. "Tonight is a night of masks," she said, her tone measured. "But not just the ones you wear on your faces. We all wear masks, don't we? Masks of wealth, of status, of power. We present ourselves in ways that we believe will be most advantageous, most acceptable to those around us." She looked around the room, her gaze lingering briefly on several guests. Margaret, Jonathan, Henry, before moving on. "But what happens when the masks come off? When we can no longer hide behind the identities we've crafted for ourselves? There was a tension in the room now, a sense of unease mixed with curiosity. The guests exchanged glances, some uncertain, others intrigued, but all of them captivated by Evelyn's words. Tonight, Evelyn continued, I want to invite you to remove your masks. Not just the physical ones, but the ones you wear every day. I want to see who you really are, without the trappings of wealth or status. The guests hesitated, unsure of what to make of this request. A few of them reached up to their masks, fingers hovering uncertainly, but no one moved to remove them. Seeing their reluctance, Evelyn smiled gently. I know it's not easy. We've all become so accustomed to our masks that the idea of taking them off can be frightening, but I promise you there's nothing to fear. In fact, I believe you might find it liberating. She paused, then added, and for those of you who choose to remove your masks, there will be a reward, a glimpse of something far more valuable than what you brought with you tonight. The word reward hung in the air, and slowly, hesitantly, some of the guests began to comply. One by one, they reached up and removed their masks, revealing their faces to the room. Evelyn watched as the first few did so, noting the expressions of discomfort, relief, and, most intriguingly, uncertainty that crossed their features. Margaret was one of the last to remove her mask. She did so with a practiced grace, but there was a tightness around her mouth, a flicker of doubt in her eyes as she revealed her face. She looked around at the others, her gaze lingering on those she considered her social equals, as if seeking reassurance in their shared vulnerability. Jonathan King was more deliberate. He removed his mask slowly, almost as if he were weighing the consequences of doing so. His expression remained impassive, but there was a hard glint in his eyes that suggested he was not as unaffected as he pretended to be. Henry Thompson, on the other hand, removed his mask with a sense of quiet acceptance. He had never been one to hide behind facades, and the act of unmasking felt more like a formality than anything else. But as he stood there exposed among the crowd, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also a sense of trepidation. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he trusted that whatever was about to happen would be worth the risk. Once the majority of the guests had removed their masks, Evelyn nodded in satisfaction. Thank you, she said softly. Now that we're all here, as we truly are, I'd like to introduce myself. She reached up and slowly removed her own mask, revealing her face to the room. A collective gasp went up from the crowd as recognition dawned. Evelyn Carter, the woman who had orchestrated this entire evening, was not just another guest. She was one of the city's most successful and enigmatic figures, known for her philanthropic efforts and her almost mythical rise from poverty to prominence. For a moment there was stunned silence, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric and the faint clinking of glasses. The guests stared at her, trying to reconcile the elegant, unassuming woman before them with the image of the powerful, elusive figure they had heard so much about. I'm sure many of you are wondering why I brought you here tonight, Evelyn said, her voice calm and steady. The truth is, I wanted to create a space where we could all come together as equals, without the masks that usually define us. A place where we could connect on a deeper level, beyond the superficial trappings of wealth and status. She let her words sink in before continuing. I know that for some of you, this may be uncomfortable. It's not easy to let go of the identities we've built for ourselves. But I believe that if we can do that, if we can see each other as we truly are, then we can begin to understand what really matters. Evelyn's eyes swept across the room, taking in the varied reactions. Some of the guests looked uncomfortable, others intrigued, but all of them were listening intently. And as I promised, as she added, there is a reward for those who choose to embrace this opportunity. I won't say more just yet, but I assure you, it will be worth your while. With that, she stepped back, allowing the guests to absorb her words. The room was abuzz with whispered conversations, a mix of excitement, confusion, and speculation. Evelyn knew that this was only the beginning, that the true unmasking would happen not in this moment, but in the hours to come, as the guests interacted with each other without the barriers they were so accustomed to. For now, she had done what she needed to do. The masks were off, and the night was truly beginning. The ballroom was abuzz with a new energy after Evelyn's revelation. The guests, now unmasked, were more exposed than they had been at any other point during the evening. It wasn't just their faces that were visible. There was a rawness to their expressions, a mix of vulnerability and uncertainty that rippled through the crowd. Margaret Whitmore was the first to break the tense silence that had settled after Evelyn's speech. She forced a bright, confident smile, trying to reassert her dominance over the situation. "Well," she said, her voice loud enough to draw attention, "this certainly adds a twist to the evening, doesn't it? I must say, I wasn't expecting to be part of such an unconventional gathering." A few of the guests chuckled nervously, eager to latch onto anything that might bring a sense of normalcy back to the night. But the tension in the room was still palpable, and Margaret's attempt to brush it off only highlighted the unease. Jonathan King, ever the pragmatist, took a different approach. He moved toward Evelyn, his expression guarded but curious. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice measured, "you've certainly given us something to think about. But I have to wonder, what exactly do you hope to achieve with this unmasking?" Evelyn met his gaze evenly, her own expression calm. "What I hope to achieve, Mr. King, is for us to see each other as we truly are, to strip away the pretense and connect on a deeper level. I believe that we can learn a great deal about ourselves and each other when we're not hiding behind the roles society has assigned us." Jonathan nodded slowly, though his eyes remained skeptical. "And you think we can accomplish that in one evening?" Evelyn smiled slightly. "It's a start." Jonathan seemed to consider this for a moment, then inclined his head in a gesture of reluctant acceptance. "Fair enough, but I'll be interested to see where this leads." As Jonathan stepped back, the other guests began to engage in hesitant conversation, trying to navigate this new landscape where they were no longer shielded by their masks. The room buzzed with a mix of nervous energy and curiosity as people began to reveal parts of themselves that had been hidden behind carefully constructed personas. Henry Thompson found himself standing alone near the edge of the crowd, still processing everything that had happened. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and he wasn't quite sure how to feel about it. On one hand, he appreciated Evelyn's intentions. There was something refreshing about the idea of seeing people for who they truly were, without the layers of artifice that so often obscured their true selves. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was out of place here, surrounded by people whose lives were so different from his own. As he stood there lost in thought, Evelyn approached him, her expression warm and inviting. "Are you doing okay, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her voice gentle. Henry looked up, surprised to find her standing so close. "Oh yes, I'm fine. Just taking it all in, I suppose." Evelyn nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "It's a lot to process, I know, but I'm glad you're here. You have a unique perspective, and I think that's important." Henry wasn't sure how to respond to that. He had never considered himself particularly important, especially not in a room full of people who seemed to have everything he didn't: money, status, power. But there was something in Evelyn's tone that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't expected. "Thank you," he said quietly, not knowing what else to say. Evelyn smiled, her gaze steady. "You're welcome. I meant what I said earlier. There's something valuable in being able to see the world as it truly is, without the masks. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Henry nodded, though he still felt a little unsure. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I'm not like the others. I don't have their kind of wealth or influence." Evelyn's smile softened. "That's exactly why you're important, Henry. You see things differently, and that perspective is valuable. Don't underestimate what you bring to the table." Henry looked at her, trying to find the right words. "I appreciate that, but it's hard not to feel out of place here." Evelyn's eyes were kind as she reached out and gently touched his arm. "You're here for a reason, Henry. Don't doubt that. And remember, tonight isn't about who has the most money or the most connections. It's about something much deeper." Henry nodded again, feeling a little more at ease. "I'll try to remember that." Evelyn gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. "Take your time. The night is still young, and there's plenty of room for unexpected connections." As Evelyn moved away to speak with other guests, Henry felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, uncertainty, and a faint flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what the rest of the evening would bring, but he knew that Evelyn's words had touched something inside him. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him here after all. Meanwhile, Margaret Whitmore was attempting to reassert her control over the situation, her voice ringing out as she addressed a small group of guests who had gathered around her. "It's fascinating, really," she was saying, her tone bright and confident. "I suppose we all wear masks in our daily lives, don't we? But it's important to remember who we are beneath them." The guests around her nodded in agreement, eager to align themselves with Margaret's confident demeanor. But there was a tension in her posture, a tightness in her smile that betrayed her own discomfort. Margaret was not used to being caught off guard, and the evening's events had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Jonathan King, observing Margaret from across the room, couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay composed in any situation, and tonight was no exception. While the others scrambled to find their footing, Jonathan remained calm, his mind already working through the possibilities that this unmasking might present. He wasn't entirely convinced by Evelyn's lofty ideals, but he knew how to adapt, and he intended to make the most of the situation. As the guests continued to navigate the shifting dynamics of the evening, Evelyn observed them with quiet satisfaction. The masks were off, and the true unmasking had begun. Some of the guests were struggling to adjust, while others were finding new ways to assert themselves. But underneath it all, Evelyn could see the beginnings of something real, connections that were not based on wealth or status, but on something deeper, something more human. The night was far from over, and Evelyn knew that the most important moments were yet to come. But as she watched the guests interact, she felt a sense of fulfillment. This was what she had hoped for, a night where the masks would come off, and the truth would begin to reveal itself. The night wore on, and with each passing hour, the guests grew more accustomed to their unmasked selves. Some embraced this new openness with a sense of liberation, while others clung desperately to the remnants of their former facades. The shift in dynamics was palpable, creating an undercurrent of tension that ebbed and flowed through the ballroom. Evelyn Carter watched it all with keen interest, her eyes constantly moving from one group of guests to another. She had anticipated some resistance to her experiment, but even she hadn't predicted the stark divide that was beginning to form among her guests. The unmasking had not only revealed their true selves, it had also highlighted the chasm between those who were willing to embrace change and those who weren't. Margaret Whitmore was among the latter. Despite her earlier attempt to maintain control, she found herself increasingly isolated as the night progressed. The confidence she had tried so hard to project was starting to fray at the edges, and it didn't go unnoticed by the other guests. Margaret's voice, once so commanding, had become brittle, and her attempts to steer the conversation felt forced. "Really, it's all rather amusing, isn't it?" she said, laughing a little too loudly as she addressed a small group of guests. "This idea that we should all just strip away our identities and pretend we're something we're not, it's quite the social experiment. But I'm afraid it's a bit too idealistic for my taste." The guests around her exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge Margaret directly. They nodded politely, but their attention drifted, and soon they began to peel away from the group, leaving Margaret standing alone. Margaret's smile faltered, and she quickly downed the last of her champagne before turning to find another group to engage. But as she scanned the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was shifting beneath her feet. For the first time in years, Margaret Whitmore was no longer the center of attention. Across the room, Jonathan King observed Margaret's struggles with a mixture of amusement and disdain. He had always found her overbearing, and now that her influence was waning, he felt a certain satisfaction in watching her falter. But Jonathan was not one to gloat openly. Instead, he remained quiet, biding his time as he assessed the situation. Unlike Margaret, Jonathan had adapted quickly to the night's events. He understood that power was not just about wealth or status. It was about perception, about how others saw you and how you could use that to your advantage. And right now, Jonathan knew that the real power in the room lay with Evelyn Carter. As if sensing his thoughts, Evelyn approached Jonathan, her expression unreadable. "Mr. King," she greeted him with a nod. "How are you finding the evening so far?" Jonathan returned her gaze, his own expression carefully neutral. "It's been enlightening," he replied. "You've certainly succeeded in shaking things up." Evelyn smiled faintly. "That was the idea. But I'm curious, what do you make of it all? Do you think this unmasking will lead to anything meaningful?" Jonathan considered her question for a moment before answering. "I think it depends on the people involved. Some of us are more willing to adapt than others. But in the end, it's not about the masks we wear. It's about the choices we make once those masks are gone." Evelyn nodded, seemingly satisfied with his response. "I agree, and I think tonight will reveal a great deal about who we truly are." Jonathan allowed himself a small smile. "Indeed. But tell me, Ms. Carter, what do you hope to gain from all of this?" Evelyn's gaze was steady, but there was a hint of something deeper in her eyes, something that Jonathan couldn't quite read. "I'm not looking to gain anything, Mr. King. I'm more interested in what we all stand to learn." Jonathan inclined his head, acknowledging her words, but he remained skeptical. He had never been one to believe in lofty ideals or altruistic motives. In his experience, everyone had an agenda, even if they didn't admit it. As Evelyn moved on to speak with other guests, Jonathan continued to watch her, his mind working through the possibilities. Whatever her true intentions were, Jonathan knew that the night was far from over, and there were still plenty of opportunities to turn the situation to his advantage. Meanwhile, Henry Thompson found himself drawn into a conversation with a small group of guests who had gathered near one of the large windows overlooking the city. Unlike the more prominent figures in the room, these guests were quieter, more introspective, and they seemed genuinely interested in getting to know one another. One of the guests, a woman named Clara, turned to Henry with a warm smile. "It's been quite the night, hasn't it?" she said. "I don't think any of us expected this." Henry nodded, grateful for the genuine connection. "It's definitely been unexpected, but I think that's what makes it interesting. It's not often we get the chance to see people as they really are." Clara nodded in agreement. "It's true, I've had more meaningful conversations tonight than I have at most events like this. It's like the masks were keeping us from really connecting." Another guest, a man named Peter, chimed in. "I've been thinking the same thing. It's strange, but without the masks, I feel like I can actually be myself. I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not." Henry smiled, feeling a sense of camaraderie with these people. "It's refreshing, isn't it? I think we're so used to putting up walls that we forget what it's like to just be honest with each other." As the group continued to talk, Henry found himself opening up in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was truly part of something, rather than just an outsider looking in. The connections he was forming were real, not based on wealth or status, but on shared experiences and genuine understanding. But not everyone was finding the night so liberating. Margaret, having been rebuffed by several groups of guests, finally found herself near the bar, nursing a fresh glass of champagne. She was seething inside, her frustration barely concealed behind a mask of forced calm. How had things gone so wrong? She had come to this party expecting to dominate, to be the center of attention as she always was, but instead, she found herself marginalized, ignored by people who once hung on her every word. As she stood there fuming, Jonathan King approached, his expression unreadable. "Margaret," he greeted her with a nod. "Enjoying the evening?" Margaret forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "As much as one can, I suppose. Though I must say, I find this whole unmasking business to be rather tedious." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Tedious? Or unsettling?" Margaret's smile tightened. "What's unsettling about it? We're all just people, aren't we? Masks or no masks, it doesn't change who we are." Jonathan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Perhaps. But it seems to me that some people are finding it harder to adjust than others." Margaret's eyes flashed with irritation. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Jonathan shrugged, his tone casual. "Just an observation. Some of us are more comfortable in our own skin, while others, well, let's just say they rely a bit too much on the mask they wear." Margaret's grip tightened on her glass, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I don't know what you're implying, Jonathan, but I assure you, I have nothing to hide." Jonathan smiled, though it was more of a smirk. "Of course not, Margaret, of course not." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret seething in his wake. She knew what he was trying to do, undermine her, make her doubt herself, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She had worked too hard, built too much to let it all unravel now. But as she looked around the room, seeing the way the other guests were interacting, open, unguarded, connecting in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or status, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Whitmore wasn't sure where she fit in. Evelyn, who had been quietly observing from a distance, noticed Margaret's growing agitation. She hadn't intended for anyone to feel alienated tonight, but she knew that change was never easy, especially for those who had the most to lose. Still, she couldn't help but feel that this was a necessary part of the process, a breaking down of the old order to make way for something new. As the night continued, the rift between the guests became more pronounced. Some, like Henry and Clara, found themselves forging genuine connections, unburdened by the need to impress or compete. Others, like Margaret and Jonathan, struggled to maintain their old ways of thinking, clinging to the trappings of status even as they began to lose their grip. And through it all, Evelyn watched, waiting for the final act to unfold. The tension in the ballroom had reached a breaking point. What had begun as an elegant, if unconventional gathering, was now teetering on the edge of something more raw and unpredictable. The masks were gone, and with them, the carefully constructed social order that had held the group together. As the night wore on, it became clear that not everyone would emerge from this unscathed. Henry Thompson was acutely aware of the shift. He had spent most of the evening observing from the sidelines, feeling more like a spectator than a participant. But as the dynamics continued to evolve, he found himself drawn into the heart of the action. It started when Clara, who had been one of the few people to make him feel at ease, invited him to join her and a few others in a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Come on, Henry," she urged with a warm smile. "We're just talking. No need to feel out of place." Henry hesitated for a moment, then nodded and followed her. The group she had gathered was a mix of people he had met earlier in the evening, as well as a few new faces. They were engaged in a conversation that was surprisingly candid, given the circumstances. "I never realized how much we all hide behind our wealth," one man was saying. "It's like we use it as a shield to protect ourselves from, I don't know, from actually having to deal with who we really are." Another guest, a woman named Lila, nodded in agreement. "It's true, I've always felt like I had to live up to this image of success. But tonight feels different. It's like we're finally being honest with each other." Henry listened, intrigued by the conversation. He had always felt that there was more to life than the pursuit of wealth and status. But hearing others express similar thoughts was a revelation. He wasn't alone in his feelings. Clara turned to him, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What about you, Henry? What's your take on all of this?" Henry paused, unsure of how to put his thoughts into words. I think we spend so much time trying to impress each other that we forget what's really important. Tonight, without the masks, it feels like we're finally getting to the heart of things, and it's freeing." The group nodded in agreement, and for the first time that evening, Henry felt a genuine connection with the people around him. They weren't just talking about superficial things. They were sharing their true thoughts and the feelings, and it was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. As the conversation continued, Henry began to feel more at ease. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued him earlier in the evening started to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging. These people, despite their wealth and status, were just like him, searching for something real in a world that often felt hollow. But not everyone in the room was having the same experience. Margaret Whitmore, still seething from her earlier exchanges, had retreated to a small group of her closest friends. They were the last remnants of her social circle, and she clung to them like a lifeline. "This whole thing is ridiculous," Margaret muttered, her voice low but filled with anger. "Evelyn thinks she can just waltz in here and turn everything upside down. Well, I won't stand for it." Her friends exchanged uneasy glances but didn't argue. They were used to Margaret's tirades, and none of them wanted to be the one to challenge her. One of them, a woman named Sylvia, tried to soothe her. "Margaret, maybe we should just try to go along with it. Evelyn she's made her point. There's no need to make a scene." Margaret's eyes flashed with indignation. "No need to make a scene? Do you hear yourself, Sylvia? We're being made fools of, and you want us to just sit back and take it?" Sylvia recoiled slightly, but before she could respond, Jonathan King approached the group, his expression cool and detached. "Margaret, perhaps you should calm down. Getting worked up isn't going to change anything." Margaret turned on him, her anger now fully unleashed. "Calm down? You expect me to calm down while Evelyn Carter humiliates us in front of everyone? What is wrong with you, Jonathan? Don't you see what's happening?" Jonathan remained unfazed, his voice measured. "I see exactly what's happening, Margaret, and what I see is a group of people who are struggling to adapt to a situation they didn't expect. But getting angry won't solve anything. It will only make you look foolish." Margaret opened her mouth to retort, but something in Jonathan's tone stopped her. There was a cold, cutting edge to his words that made her hesitate. For the first time that night, she felt a flicker of doubt, a gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, she was losing control. Jonathan saw the hesitation in her eyes and pressed his advantage. "This is a game, Margaret, a game that Evelyn has set up, and right now she's winning. But if you let your emotions get the better of you, you'll lose. And you hate losing, don't you?" Margaret swallowed hard, her anger momentarily giving way to a steely resolve. She did hate losing, more than anything. "I won't lose," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Good, then let's figure out how to turn this around." As the two of them began to strategize, Evelyn watched from across the room. She could see the shift in Margaret's demeanor, the way she was rallying her remaining allies. It was exactly what Evelyn had expected. Margaret was not the type to back down easily, and Evelyn knew that the real challenge was yet to come. But Evelyn wasn't worried. She had planned for this, anticipated the resistance. What mattered now was how the rest of the guests responded, and from what she could see, many of them were beginning to embrace the changes the evening had brought. In another corner of the room, Clara and Henry's group had grown, with more guests joining in the conversation. They were discussing everything from the pressures of maintaining their social status to the loneliness that often accompanied wealth. It was a far cry from the shallow small talk that usually dominated such events, and the atmosphere was one of genuine camaraderie. Henry found himself speaking more freely than he had in years, sharing his thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment. The more he talked, the more he realized that he wasn't alone in his struggles. These people, despite their wealth and privilege, were just as human as he was. As the night continued, the divide between the guests became more pronounced. On one side were those like Margaret and Jonathan, who clung to the old ways, desperate to maintain their control. On the other side were people like Henry and Clara, who were beginning to see the value in vulnerability and honesty. And at the center of it all was Evelyn, quietly orchestrating the evening's events with a calm, steady hand. She had set the stage, but now it was up to the guests to decide how the night would end. As midnight approached, the tension in the room reached a crescendo. Conversations became more intense, emotions more raw. The guests were no longer just playing a part. They were revealing their true selves, and the results were both exhilarating and terrifying. In the midst of it all, Henry found himself standing alone near the edge of the room, watching the scene unfold. He felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude for the connections he had made, but also a lingering sense of unease. There was something in the air, a feeling that something big was about to happen. As if on cue, Evelyn stepped forward, her voice cutting through the din. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Evelyn smiled, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I know this has been an unusual evening, and I appreciate your willingness to engage in something different." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But as the night draws to a close, I want to leave you with one final thought. What you take from this evening is entirely up to you. The masks are off, and you've seen each other and yourselves in a new light. What you do with that knowledge is your choice." Evelyn's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The guests exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncertain. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that this was the turning point, the moment when everything would change. But whether that change would be for better or worse, he couldn't say. The night was far from over, and the final act had yet to unfold. The ballroom was suffused with an uneasy silence, the weight of Evelyn's words pressing down on the guests like a thick fog. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Then, as if on cue, the grandfather clock in the corner began to chime midnight, each resonant toll marking the passage of time with a deliberate, unyielding finality. Evelyn stood at the center of the room, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the anxious energy radiating from the crowd. She had given them the final nudge, and now it was up to them to decide how they would respond. Her gaze swept over the guests, searching for signs of what was to come. Henry Thompson felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the last chime echoed through the room. He had spent most of the evening on the periphery, trying to make sense of the night's events. But now he sensed that something significant was about to happen, something that would force him and everyone else in the room to confront the truths they had been avoiding. Margaret Whitmore was the first to break the silence. Her voice, usually so commanding, was brittle with suppressed emotion. "Well, Evelyn," she began, her words laced with a sharp edge, "this has been quite the spectacle. But I have to wonder, what was the point of all this? What exactly are you trying to prove?" The question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in a thin veneer of civility. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the underlying hostility in Margaret's tone. Evelyn, however, remained unflappable. "The point, Margaret," Evelyn replied evenly, "is that we all hide behind masks, whether they're literal or figurative. Tonight was about revealing who we are underneath those masks. It was an opportunity to see each other and ourselves more clearly." Margaret's lips curled into a thin smile. "And what exactly did you see, Evelyn? Did you find what you were looking for?" Evelyn's expression softened, and for the first time that evening, A hint of vulnerability crept into her voice. I saw people struggling to maintain the personas they've carefully constructed. I saw fear, insecurity, and the need for validation. But I also saw glimpses of honesty, of real connection. And that, Margaret, is what I was hoping for. Margaret's smile faltered, and for a brief moment she looked almost uncertain, but she quickly masked her hesitation with a derisive laugh. How noble of you, Evelyn. But not all of us have the luxury of indulging in such lofty ideals. Some of us have real responsibilities, real lives to maintain. The tension in the room ratcheted up a notch as Margaret's words struck a nerve with several guests. It was a reminder of the stakes involved, of the precarious balance they all walk between their public personas and their private selves. Jonathan King, who had been watching the exchange with interest, decided to step in. I think what Evelyn is trying to say, Margaret, is that perhaps we've all become too comfortable with our masks. Maybe it's time to reassess what really matters to us, beyond the wealth, beyond the status. Margaret shot him a withering look. Spare me the sermon, Jonathan. We all know what this is really about. Evelyn wanted to play puppeteer to see how far she could push us. Well, congratulations, Evelyn. You've succeeded. But don't think for a moment that this will change anything. When we leave this place, we'll put our masks back on, and life will go on as it always has. Her words, harsh as they were, resonated with many in the room. There was a murmur of agreement from several guests, and for a moment it seemed as if Margaret's defiance would carry the day. But then Clara, who had been quietly listening from the sidelines, spoke up. Maybe that's the problem, she said softly, yet with a conviction that caught everyone's attention. Maybe we've gotten so used to our masks that we've forgotten who we are without them. I don't know about the rest of you, but tonight has made me realize how much I've been hiding, how much I've been missing. Her words hung in the air, a stark contrast to Margaret's cynicism. The room fell silent once more, and all eyes turned to Evelyn, waiting to see how she would respond. Evelyn met Clara's gaze, a small, appreciative smile playing at the corners of her lips. Thank you, Clara, she said gently. That's exactly what I was hoping for us to start thinking about what lies beneath the surface. It's not about tearing down everything we've built. It's about understanding what's real and what's just a facade. Henry, who had been quietly absorbing the conversation, felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. Clara's words had struck a chord with him, echoing the thoughts he had been wrestling with all night. For years, he had felt like an outsider in this world of wealth and privilege, but he had always assumed that the fault lay with him, that he simply wasn't cut out for it. But now he was beginning to see that perhaps the problem wasn't with him at all. Perhaps it was the masks they all wore, the roles they played, that were the true source of his discomfort. Taking a deep breath, Henry decided to speak up. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm tired of pretending. Tonight has made me realize how much I've been hiding, not just from others, but from myself. I think it's time we start being honest about who we really are and what we really want. His words, spoken with quiet determination, resonated with several guests. There were nods of agreement, and the atmosphere in the room shifted slightly. The tension was still there, but it was now tempered by a sense of possibility. A sense that perhaps, just perhaps, something meaningful could come out of this night. Margaret, however, was not ready to let go of her anger. And what do you suggest, Henry? She demanded, her tone sharp. That we all just throw away everything we've worked for, everything we've achieved, and start over. It's not that simple. Henry met her gaze steadily. No, it's not. But maybe it's worth considering what we're holding on to and why. Are we really happy with the lives we've built? Or are we just clinging to them because we're afraid of what might happen if we let go? Margaret opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, Jonathan cut in. He's right, Margaret. We've all been so focused on maintaining our status, our image, that we've forgotten what it's like to actually live. Maybe it's time we start thinking about what really matters. Margaret hesitated, her anger warring with a growing sense of doubt. She could feel the eyes of the other guests on her, waiting to see how she would respond. Part of her wanted to dismiss Henry and Jonathan's words as naive, as nothing more than the idealistic musings of people who didn't understand the real world. But another part of her, an increasingly insistent part, wondered if there might be some truth to what they were saying. The room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Then, to everyone's surprise, Margaret let out a long, weary sigh. I don't know, she said quietly, her voice devoid of its usual bravado. Maybe you're right. Maybe we've all been so caught up in playing our roles that we've lost sight of who we really are. The admission hung in the air, a shocking concession from someone who had always prided herself on her strength, her ability to control any situation. The guests exchanged stunned glances, unsure of how to respond. Evelyn, sensing the shift, stepped forward once more. "Margaret, none of this is about tearing down what we've built. It's about recognizing that we don't have to be defined by it. We can choose to be more, to live more authentically without losing what we've accomplished." Margaret looked at her, and for the first time that night, there was a flicker of something like understanding in her eyes. And what if we don't know how to do that? What if we've been wearing the masks for so long that we don't even know who we are without them? Evelyn smiled gently. Then that's where we start, by taking small steps, by being honest with ourselves and with each other. It's not about changing everything overnight. It's about making choices that align with who we truly are. For a moment, Margaret said nothing, her mind racing as she processed Evelyn's words. Then slowly she nodded. "Maybe you're right," she admitted. "Maybe it's time we all stop pretending." The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. The guests, who had spent the night navigating the complexities of their own emotions, were now beginning to see the possibility of something different, something better. Henry, feeling a sense of relief he hadn't anticipated, glanced around the room and saw that he wasn't alone in his feelings. There were others, Clara, Jonathan, even Margaret, who were beginning to question the roles they had been playing, the masks they had been wearing. And for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Evelyn, seeing the shift in the room, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The night was drawing to a close, but the journey was just beginning. The guests had been given a glimpse of what could be, and now it was up to them to decide how they would move forward. As the guests began to disperse, each lost in their own thoughts, Evelyn caught Henry's eye and nodded slightly. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. Henry returned the nod, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged. As the last guest trickled out of the ballroom, Evelyn stood alone in the center of the room, taking in the remnants of the evening. The masks were gone, the facade had been stripped away, and what remained was something raw, something real. And that, she thought to herself, was exactly what she had hoped for. The day after the party dawned with a crisp, clear morning, the early sunlight filtering through the curtains of Evelyn's spacious bedroom. She lay awake in bed, reflecting on the previous night's events. The confrontation, the emotions, the revelations, all of it had left her feeling both exhilarated and drained. But there was still one more thing she needed to do, one final thread to tie up before she could truly consider the night a success. Downstairs, Henry was already awake, seated at the long dining table that had been cleared of the remnants of the party. He sipped his coffee, his mind still processing everything that had happened. The conversations, the unmasking, the vulnerability. It had all been so intense, so unlike anything he had ever experienced. He wasn't sure what to make of it all, but one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were before. As he sat there, lost in thought, Evelyn entered the room. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a newfound lightness to her steps, a sense of relief that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Henry," she greeted him with a warm smile. Henry looked up, surprised to see her so early. "Good morning, Evelyn. I didn't expect to see you up so soon." Evelyn chuckled softly. "Neither did I, but I suppose last night gave me a lot to think about." Henry nodded, understanding. "It was quite the evening." "It was," Evelyn agreed, taking a seat across from him. "And I wanted to thank you, Henry. You were one of the few who really understood what I was trying to do." Henry shrugged modestly. "I just said what I was feeling. I think a lot of us were starting to realize that maybe we've been living a lie." Evelyn studied him for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "And what do you plan to do about it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Henry hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. "I've spent so much time trying to fit into this world, trying to be something I'm not. But now, I'm not sure what comes next." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "It's not an easy decision, Henry, but I believe that the fact you're even considering it means you're already on the right path." Henry looked at her, searching for some hint of what she was thinking. "What about you, Evelyn? What's next for you?" Evelyn smiled, a hint of mystery in her eyes. "I have my own plans, Henry, but that's a conversation for another time. Right now, I want to talk about you." Henry frowned slightly, puzzled. "Me? Yes, you, Evelyn confirmed. Last night I saw something in you, a willingness to be honest with yourself, to face the truth no matter how uncomfortable it might be. That's a rare quality, Henry, and it's something I think you should nurture. Henry wasn't sure what to say. He had always seen himself as the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong. But now here was Evelyn, one of the most powerful and influential people he knew, telling him that he had something valuable, something worth cultivating. What do you suggest? He asked, his curiosity piqued. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. I suggest you take some time to really think about what you want out of life, Henry. Not what you think you should want, or what others expect of you, but what you truly desire. And when you figure that out, don't be afraid to go after it, even if it means leaving everything else behind. Henry was silent, mulling over her words. It was a daunting prospect, the idea of abandoning the life he had worked so hard to build. But at the same time, it was also liberating, a chance to start fresh, to create something new and authentic. I'll think about it, he finally said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Evelyn smiled again, this time with a hint of encouragement. That's all I ask, Henry. Just think about it. And remember, you're not alone in this. If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. Henry nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude toward Evelyn that he couldn't quite put into words. She had given him something precious, the freedom to choose, to take control of his own life. As they sat in companionable silence, the sound of a door opening caught their attention. Clara entered the room, looking slightly hesitant as she approached them. Good morning, she greeted them softly. Good morning, Clara, Evelyn replied, gesturing for her to join them at the table. How are you feeling? Clara smiled, though it was a little strained. A bit overwhelmed, to be honest. Last night was a lot to take in. Evelyn nodded in understanding. It was, but I'm glad you're here. I was just talking to Henry about what comes next. Clara glanced at Henry, then back at Evelyn. And what does come next? That's up to you, Clara, Evelyn said gently. You've been given a glimpse of what's possible. Now it's time to decide what you want to do with that knowledge. Clara's expression grew thoughtful as she considered Evelyn's words. I don't know if I'm ready to make any big decisions yet, but I do know that I don't want to keep living the way I have been. That's a good start, Evelyn said encouragingly. And remember, there's no rush. Take your time, figure out what matters to you. And when you're ready, make the changes that will bring you closer to that. Clara nodded slowly, a small smile forming on her lips. Thank you, Evelyn. I appreciate that. As the three of them sat together, the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of uncertainty to one of quiet determination. They were all at different points in their journeys, but they were united by a common desire to live more authentically, to shed the masks they had worn for so long. The conversation continued, the three of them discussing their hopes, their fears, and the possibilities that lay ahead. It was a conversation filled with honesty, vulnerability, and the beginnings of real connection, something that had been sorely missing from their lives for far too long. By the time the morning sun had fully risen, the mood in the room had lightened considerably. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time they felt ready to face it together. And as they parted ways, each heading off to begin their respective journeys, there was a sense of closure, of resolution. The party had been a turning point, a catalyst for change, and now it was up to them to carry that change forward. Evelyn watched them go, a deep sense of satisfaction settling over her. She had done what she set out to do. She had planted the seeds, and now it was time for them to grow. As she turned to leave the room, a thought crossed her mind. Sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with the smallest of steps. And with that, she walked out into the bright morning light, ready to begin the next chapter of her own journey. Weeks had passed since the night of the party, and the city had settled back into its usual rhythm. The events of that evening had been the talk of the social circles for days. But as time went on, the stories and speculations began to fade, replaced by the next scandal or sensation. But for those who had been there, the memory lingered, shaping their thoughts and actions in ways that few could have predicted. Evelyn had returned to her routines, but with a new sense of purpose. The party had been a success, in more ways than one, and she could see the changes it had sparked in the people around her. It was subtle, but there was a shift in the way they interacted, a newfound openness and honesty that hadn't been there before. It was exactly what she had hoped for, and more. Today, however, wasn't about the others. Today was about her and a promise she intended to keep. She had arranged to meet Henry at a small cafe downtown, far from the opulent mansions and luxury hotels that usually filled their social calendars. It was a place she frequented often, a sanctuary of sorts where she could escape the trappings of her wealth and status, if only for a little while. When she arrived, Henry was already there, seated at a table near the window. He looked different, more relaxed, more at ease with himself. As she approached, he stood up and greeted her with a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "thank you for meeting me." "Of course, Henry," she replied, returning the smile. "I'm glad you reached out." They sat down and a comfortable silence settled between them as they ordered their drinks. There was no rush, no need for formalities. They both knew why they were there. After a few moments, Evelyn spoke. "How have you been, Henry? How's life treating you?" Henry took a sip of his coffee, considering her question. "It's been different," he admitted. "After the party, I took some time to really think about what you said, about being honest with myself. I realized that I'd been living a life that didn't really belong to me, a life that was more about meeting other people's expectations than my own." Evelyn nodded, encouraging him to continue. "So," Henry went on, "I made some changes. I stepped down from a few of the boards I was on, started volunteering at a local community center. It's something I've always wanted to do but never felt like I had the time for. And you know what? It's been freeing. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that really matters." Evelyn's smile widened. "That's wonderful, Henry. I'm so glad you found something that makes you feel fulfilled." Henry looked at her, his expression serious. "I have you to thank for that, Evelyn. If it weren't for that night, for the way you challenged us, I don't know if I ever would have had the courage to make these changes." Evelyn shook her head gently. "You had it in you all along, Henry. All I did was help you see it." They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a connection forged not by shared experiences, but by a mutual respect for the journey each had undertaken. "And what about you, Evelyn?" Henry asked after a while. "What's next for you?" Evelyn's eyes sparkled with a mix of excitement and contentment. "I've been working on a few projects that are close to my heart," she said. "One of them is a foundation I'm starting, focused on providing resources and opportunities to underprivileged communities. It's something I've been passionate about for a long time, but I've always been too busy with other things. Now I'm making it a priority." Henry nodded, clearly impressed. "That sounds incredible. You're going to make a real difference, Evelyn." "I hope so," she replied, her tone humble. "But more than that, I'm doing it because it's something that aligns with who I am and what I believe in. I've spent too many years being what others expected me to be. Now it's time to be true to myself." Henry smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. "It sounds like we're both on the same path then, figuring out who we really are and what we want to do with the rest of our lives." "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "And I think that's the most important journey any of us can take." They continued talking, the conversation flowing easily as they shared their hopes, their dreams, and the lessons they had learned. It was a conversation filled with honesty and sincerity, a stark contrast to the guarded, surface-level interactions that had once defined their lives. As the afternoon wore on, the cafe slowly emptied, the hustle and bustle of the city outside fading into the background. But Evelyn and Henry remained, lost in their conversation, the rest of the world momentarily forgotten. Eventually, the time came for them to part ways. As they stood up to leave, Henry turned to Evelyn, his expression serious. "Thank you, Evelyn," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You've helped me more than you know." Evelyn reached out and gently squeezed his hand. "And you've helped me too, Henry. We've both come a long way, and I'm proud of the progress we've made. But remember, this is just the beginning." Henry nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "I know, and I'm ready for whatever comes next." They parted with a sense of optimism, each carrying the lessons of the past with them as they moved forward into the future. It wasn't just about the changes they had made. It was about the mindset they had adopted, one that embraced authenticity, self-awareness, and a commitment to living life on their own terms. For Evelyn, the journey was far from over, but she felt confident in the direction she was heading. The party had been a catalyst, a moment of revelation that had set her on a new path. And as she walked away from the cafe, she knew that she was exactly where she needed to be. For Henry, the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, he felt like he was in control of his own destiny. The masks had been discarded, the facade stripped away, leaving behind the truth of who he was and what he wanted to become. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the city, both Evelyn and Henry looked ahead with a sense of anticipation. The future was unwritten, full of possibilities they had never before considered. And as they embarked on their new beginnings, They carried with them the knowledge that the most important transformations happen not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet, deliberate choices we make every day.